Please. It's embarrassing. Enough already. I just thought this was fun.
Oh, there it goes again.
Does anybody know why it keeps cutting off and on? Anybody tech here?
Just a loose connection.
So it could be a loose connection. Oh, you mean, you weren't talking about me. Maybe I was a loose connection. Well, we'll just see if we get through with it. So if it goes out and I don't notice, then just remind me and I can render it again. I'm going to explain the salient terms here, like popular atheism and these kind of things. Maybe even say a little bit about what I mean for tonight's talk about scientific. And also just a sort of apology right up front that if you've heard me talk before, then you're going to hear some of the same stupid jokes.
Oh, no.
So you can plug your ears or whatever, but there may be people here that have never had the, what's the word here? Anyway, the unfortunate privilege of hearing me speak, and so you've now heard these jokes. So one of the things that I do, and when I give these presentations, a lot of these presentations are born out of courses that I teach at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, where I'm still part-time. So invariably, there are more slides than most people can tolerate unless they're paying tuition and they have to get it for a grade, right? But normal people probably can't tolerate as much data as I try to cram into a presentation. So, but I don't want you to feel slighted. So here's how you can get a PDF deck of the presentation you're going to see. You want that for two reasons. One, there are some slides that I've hidden for the sake of time that you can get those. And also there are other slides that are have quotations, so you want to get those so you can, we're going to be fighting this all night long, I think. Quotations, so if you want to get the reference, then you'll want to get those. So here's how you get the PDF deck. Okay, so you go to my relatively cheesy website, richardghowe.com. Okay, Richard, don't leave the G out. All right, and then notice at the top, if you can see the tab, there's one that says resources. So you click on that, and it gives you four choices. The one that's relevant for the decks is the one that's PDF decks, but there are also papers I've written, other people have written, links to the internet, multimedia, and some stuff I've done at my church. So you want the PDF decks. Now that was worth coming tonight just to hear. This page here, which is basically all the PDF decks that I've done so far in alphabetical order. So the one that's relevant for tonight is Answering the Arguments of Popular Atheism. You'll see that this is actually a segment of a four-part series, so you can get the others if you want. The one obviously tonight is the Scientific Arguments. So let me set the stage of what I mean by the phrase popular atheism, because it could be easily misunderstood, even to the point of maybe sounding insulting, and I don't mean it that way. I teach a course at the seminary titled Contemporary Atheism. And so I divide the course into three sort of categories of contemporary atheism. The first is popular, which I'll say something about here in due course, what I mean by that. The second is the new atheism, which isn't nearly as new as it used to be. Hitchens and Dawkins and those like that. And they're a little bit different than the academic atheism, which would be more of your rank and file philosophical atheists of the past century or so, like J.L. Mackie or Michael Martin or some of these guys. So what do I mean by popular atheism? I don't mean popular in the sense that it's well-liked or well-known. We use the word popular like that. What I mean is popular as contrasted with scholarly or academic. Now, by quoting someone in the context of a talk on popular atheism, I'm not implying that they themselves are not scholars or academics. But what makes popular relevant for tonight is that their writings, or at least some of their writings, are aimed at non-technicians in the field. Just like a scientist could, like Fuzz Rana, for example, could write a book that just normal people that don't do the technicalities of biomolecular or whatever he does would understand, so they just write it for a general audience. So scholarly atheists can very easily write a book that's more accessible to general audiences. So who are some of these popular atheists? Well, you're going to see as we go along, rather than taking time of rehearsing individually who they are and relevant works that they produce, you can get that off the deck, but you're actually going to see some of those here in due course as we go along. Now, when it comes to the popular atheism specifically, then I break that down into three kind of categories, just as a cataloging, a convenient way to catalog what I'm trying to respond to. The first are rhetorical arguments, which we're not going to do tonight. But these are arguments, and maybe arguments is not even the right word. They're sort of bumper sticker or t-shirt atheism. Now, I'm not maligning somebody for reducing otherwise complex thoughts into a one-liner on a t-shirt. I'm not criticizing that at all. They make great conversation starters or bumper stickers. And of course, the last people on earth that should make fun of other people doing that would be Christians, or should be Christians, because we've pretty much pioneered how to reduce important cosmic truth down to a little bumper sticker. Jesus is my co-pilot, those kind of things. So my criticism isn't that they are terse or succinct or pointed or whatever. But they imbibe certain implications and arguments that's what I'm trying to deal with. So for example, in fact, some of these are pretty clever, if not outright brilliant. One, for example, I'm not going to deal with tonight, is a bumper sticker and a t-shirt that I've seen on the internet that says, "Science flies you to the moon, religion flies you into buildings." Now, to me, that's just powerful, and it deserves a response, but we're not going to do that tonight. The other category, in the order in which I do them, are the scientific ones, which we're going to look at tonight. And I basically call them scientific, not because I'm dealing with them like a scientist would, because I'm not a scientist. I would have to defer to many others in this room for that. But rather, just in terms of the general tone of what it's doing falls more in the category of scientific kind of thinking. You'll see what we mean as we go along. Then the last are philosophical arguments, which we're not going to do. These are things like, can God make a rock too heavy for him to pick up? Those kind of conundrums that people throw out. All right, so what are the scientific arguments? Let me tell you what all of them are, just in case I don't manage my time well and we don't get through all of them. Then you'll know, well, we didn't get through all of them. I don't know why I would want you to know that. I just thought of that all of a sudden. But at any rate, you're going to know that. But maybe it'll go, well, I can't wait till we get to that one. And then we'll stay late and we'll do it. Everybody else is at Marlowe's Tavern for debrief. So here they are. One, science is all we need to understand truths about reality, including whether God exists. Two, Christianity has reacted against science because science has displaced man from the center of the universe. Three, Christianity has always stood against the advances of science. The case of Galileo is proof. Four, the Bible was written by the same people who believed that the earth was flat. Most scientists are atheists, therefore the belief in God is not scientific. Virtual particles prove that something can come from nothing. So you recognize this as a way of defending the idea that we believe the universe came into existence by a creator. And so the response would be, well, things can come into existence without having been caused to come into existence. And that's what virtual particles prove. And then last, if God created biological complexity of the world, he must be no less complex. So the idea here is all you've done is postpone the explanation a step. You've just taken a complex world and posited some cause of the world, which itself is just as, if not more, in need of an explanation than the world was to begin with. So let's take those in order. In fact, in order to do this, I have to take my coat off. Just make that up too. I don't really have to take my coat off. I'm going to lay my coat over here and then awkwardly walk back. And then I'll strategically take a sip of my coat. We can't do product placement tonight. Well, it does say Coca-Cola if you want to zoom in on that. Now, tonight's lecture is not brought to you by Coca-Cola, so I don't want to get sued. But your speaker tonight is being refreshed by a lovely beverage from Coca-Cola. So I invite the home viewer to go get your own lovely beverage.
Double back and down.
Right? Exactly. All right, so let's take these then one at a time.
Hold on, can you?
Science is all we need to understand truths about reality. including whether God exists. Just to give you some examples, and there are more that you could find on the internet, and I'm not making this up, that these actually are t-shirts and or bumper stickers. Atheist, in science we trust, or science is my religion. Let me give you a few examples and then do some kind of response to. You're all familiar with Richard Dawkins and his important and influential work, The God Delusion. And I'm just going to throw these quotes out, and then we'll revisit them here in a moment. Richard Dawkins says in The God Delusion, the presence or absence of a creative superintelligence, that's God, is unequivocally a scientific question, even if it is not in practice or not yet a decided one. So you could have an issue where the principles of a discipline are relevant to that issue, even if you have it in practice. For example, we could argue about whether Jupiter tastes like cookies and cream ice cream. We could argue that. We would know what it would take in principle to solve that, even if we could in practice probably never be able to settle the dispute of whether it does or doesn't taste like cookies and cream ice cream. And so what he's saying is, hey, even if it isn't in practice actually been decided, the principle of what discipline is relevant to the question of God's existence is that it's science. Marshall McNutt, who was the editor of the journal Science, and was the president of the American Academy of Sciences, in a fairly recent, it's been the past few years, National Geographic, in the war on science, she says this: science is a method for deciding whether what we choose to believe has a basis in the laws of nature or not. All right? We'll come back to that. And then Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow, in their book, The Grand Design, New Answers to the Ultimate Questions of Life, say this: how can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. I missed the funeral. I haven't read the obit. I'm sure Stephen Hawking's colleagues at Cambridge in the philosophy department were dismayed to discover that philosophy was dead. Be that as it may. Philosophy is not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. So what do I say in response? Well, let's look at Dawkins again. Here's what he said, just to remind you. The presence or absence of a creative superintelligence is unequivocally a scientific question, even if it is not in practice or not yet a decided one. Now let me juxtapose this statement with another statement he made earlier in his writing career in the book The Blind Watchmaker. And I want you to know that I'm not juxtaposing, probably that's not even the right word. I'm not putting these against each other, because he's saying the same thing in both quotes. But the different way they're worded, I think, highlights a very important point. He says in The Blind Watchmaker, unlike some of his theological colleagues, Bishop Montefiore is not afraid to state that the question of whether God exists is a definite question of fact. Now, what he's saying, what he's talking about in context, is that he was just delighted to run into a clergyman in his native UK who actually thought that whether there is or isn't a God was a factual question. In other words, it either is true that there's a God or it's false that there's a God. He was delighted to find a clergyman that thought that, presumably because most of the clergy in his experience were just eaten up with postmodernism. So, well, there's a God for you, there's not a God for me. It's true for you, but not for me kind of mentality. And so I agree with Dawkins that he loathes that kind of sort of relativism of knowledge that postmodernism is famous for. So I agree with him that the question of whether God exists is a question of fact. It either is or isn't true that God exists. But notice how he words the same. He hasn't changed his views. But notice how he changes the wording, because what was a question of fact, which I think is true, I agree with that. I think it's undisputable. He calls a scientific question. I would submit to you, and by the way, I do a lot of submitting and suggesting when I talk. Okay, that's just shorthand for me going, I can't make much of an argument for it right now, but I will do the best I can as I go through. But what I submit to you is that what is going on in these two quotes, as I said, are the same thing. That without argument, Dawkins has imperialized over the nature of the question. That is, without getting any argument that I've ever seen, he certainly doesn't give it in the God delusion. He just imperializes to say whether God exists or not is a question of science. But I've got news for you. Whether it is or isn't a question of science, or whether it's a question of some other discipline, is a philosophical question, whatever that means. Now, I was debating once, I think, Richard, you were at the debate I did at Georgia State with Ed Buckner. And during the Q&A, because I've been making this point about, hey, the question of God's existence, that's a philosophical question, which if you know me, you might think, well, that's self-serving because you're a philosopher. And I had a gentleman come up during the Q&A, and he said, well, who are you to say that that's a philosophical question? And I'm like, this is what philosophers do when they get stymied. They do that. And I thought, that's like walking up to somebody, that's like walking up to a botanist when he's talking about the different shapes of the leaves of some two different plants. And he starts talking about how, well, this is a botanical question. How much sense would it make to go, well, who are you to say that talking about plants is a question for botany? Just go, that's just the name we give to the study of whether there are or aren't plants of this kind or that kind. It's just called botany. That's just what it is. We've inherited that. It's been that way since Aristotle, practically. So I submit that what kind of tools are relevant in assessing the question of is there not a God? Those tools are what we have called for 2,500 years in Western civilization, philosophy. Now, what I don't have time to do here, but I do in another presentation, and I always make references to other presentations because it's my way of trying to cajole them to invite me back. Although we are getting close to the bottom of the barrel, I might have to start making stuff up. Like, baldness, pre or post fall, something like that. And I can probably go for days on that. But I make this in another presentation titled "Defending the Handmaid," because philosophy is considered that theology is the queen of the sciences, philosophy is her handmaid. So I'm actually writing a book on defending the handmaid to say this is how theology needs philosophy. There, I try to give the arguments as to what are the tools of philosophy and how are they brought to bear. But here, I'm just suggesting, at the very least, Dawkins hasn't made a case at all that the tools and methods and protocols that are relevant to the question of whether there's a God are the same tools and methods and protocols that the scientists use. You got to make an argument that that's the case. He goes on to say, in The Blind Watchmaker, there is an answer to every such question, and in the context he's talking about miracles, and by extension the existence of God. Oh, sorry, thank you. You're going to be my point man there.
Got
to
your
make
back.
sure that comes back up. I have no idea why it's doing that. I think it's Satan. He just hates powerful. He's like a whatever that Apple application is. Presenter. That's whatever.
He's a Mac guy.
Yeah, he's a Mac guy.
He's a Mac guy.
He says there is an answer to every such question about miracles, whether or not we can discover it in practice, and it's a strictly scientific answer. The methods we should use to settle the matter in the unlikely event that relevant evidence ever becomes available or became available would be purely and entirely scientific methods. Okay, so what methods does he propose? Well, he proposes scientific methods, right? In fact, they're purely in scientific methods. According to Dawkins, should scientific methods be used only for certain kind of questions or for every kind of question? At least in the relevant sense in what you're talking tonight about miracles and then by extension the existence of God. Well, every such question, purely and entirely, are questions that are assailed and answered by science. All right? My question to Dawkins then is this statement there provable by purely and entirely scientific methods? What scientific experiment could you do, either theoretical or physical, that the conclusion would be that statement right there? And the answer is there isn't one, because that's a philosophical statement. He's making what philosophers call a meta-statement. He's making a statement about how other statements are made. That's the domain of the philosopher, for better or for worse. So I would again submit that it's absolutely not provable. And I've already answered the next one. If it's not provable here, then what kind of method should be used? Well, I think it's philosophical. Now I realize, well, I don't really know what that looks like. I kind of maybe an idea what a scientific answer to a question, the tools of scientists. I'm not really sure what the tools of the philosopher would even look like. Maybe, and I didn't really plan it this way, some of those tools and methods will become sort of evident as we go through the balance of these questions And maybe you'll go, "Oh, okay, I see now what the philosophers are trying to do here." But if there is a such thing as a philosophical method, if I'm right about that, then why can't that method be used to address questions about miracles in God or whatever? That's what I'm lobbying for. That historically in Western civilization, it has been the domain of the philosopher to deal with these kinds of questions like God's existence. In fact, I think it's even worse for Dawkins because he's, I think, committing what is known as the selection effect. The selection effect is when you have some type of method of gathering data, for example, where the method itself will filter out some of the data. So suppose you're trying to do some kind of statistical analysis of the relative sizes of the marine life in this inlet here. So you throw out a net to drag through and bring up the marine life, plop it on the boat, and then you start measuring things. The problem is anything too small to get caught in the net won't be in your data pool, and anything too large to be in the net won't be in your data pool, will it? So your data pool then sort of illicitly selects by size the very thing that you're trying to measure. So by analogy, again, I would submit that the tools that we often identify as the tools of the scientists today, I think if one's not careful, it can illicitly select only part of the data. And then when you get the data and then you look at it and you come to this, well, it doesn't look like there's a God. And I would argue that's because the elements of the data that are relevant to the question of God's existence got filtered out by your method. Now, whether I'm even right about that or not is itself a philosophical question, interestingly. What about Marcia McNutt's comment? Science is a method for deciding whether what we choose to believe has a basis in the laws of nature or not. All right, well, let's see if we can make something out of that here. Hang on a second. Did I see a hand over there? Yeah, no, I'm working on it right now. I am a professional, so don't try this at home. This is very dangerous. I'm full method supervision. Science is a method for deciding whether what we choose to believe has a basis in laws of nature or not. Now, think about this statement. Presumably, Marcia McNutt believes that statement, right? I'm assuming she believes what she just said. If so, what scientific method did she use to decide whether this belief has a basis in the laws of nature or not? Did she go through some scientific experiment so that she could decide to believe what's in this box over there? Say, well, I decided to believe this because of the scientific method that I used proved this particular statement. Well, of course not. There's no scientific method that gives you that statement because it's a philosophical statement. That's why it's well, I don't want to jump ahead. So, further, exactly what laws of nature could possibly be the basis for this belief? Now, someone might say, well, you could imagine things like sort of a physical determinism, certain types of concepts in unconscious psychology where you're predetermined to believe. That's fine. We could have that debate. I don't know if that's what Marcia McNutt's position is, but I would think that just like Dawkins commits the selection effect, she is really committing a fallacy known as self-refuting. The statement is self-refuting because the statement purports to set up a criteria by which you know certain statements, or the statement itself doesn't fit that criteria. It'd be like somebody saying, I can't speak in English. You just spoke in English. You said in English you can't speak in English. She said a philosophical statement to the effect that science is what leads her to believe what she believes. It becomes self-refuting because her science didn't make her believe that. And of course, what about Hawking and Mlodinow? The philosophy is dead. Well, hopefully, at least in a tentative kind of way, it's not dead if I'm right that all of these things these guys have said up to this point all end up collapsing back into philosophical judgments. And so it not only isn't dead, the irony is the very case that all of these are making is so heavily dependent on philosophical methods, whatever those look like. We haven't said anything about what they look like, but just know that they're different than scientific methods. The irony is that not only is it not the case that philosophy is dead, philosophy is the antecedent for all these scientific things that all these people are saying. All right? What about the next one? Clear as mud? Christianity has reacted against science because science has displaced man from the center of the universe. So there's a couple of polemicists who make this point. John William Draper, and I almost brought my show and tell, because all of these books here, I have all of them, except maybe one or two. And I thought about bringing a show and tell, and then I got too lazy. I thought, I was about to do something laborious, and then I got a hold of myself and came back to my senses. He says, in thus denouncing the Copernican system as being in contradiction to revelation, the ecclesiastical authorities were doubtless deeply moved by inferential considerations. To dethrone the earth from her central dominating position, to give her many equals and not a few superiors, seems to diminish her claims upon the divine regard. Bertrand Russell, whom you met earlier as he was introducing me on his chalkboard, before Richard Dawkins' God delusion, probably the single most influential, in a deleterious way from our Christian perspective, influential treatise was Bertrand Russell's Why I Need a Speech Therapist. So that was his. But after that one was his Why I'm Not a Christian. So it's actually a book that's titled by that. So that's how important he is. But he says in his History of Western Philosophy, another thing that resulted from science was a profound change in the conceptions of man's place in the universe. In the medieval world, the earth was the center of the heavens and everything had a purpose concerned with man. In the Newtonian world, the earth is a minor planet and not a significant or not especially distinguished star. And you can get even more recent in James Newman's work. This is one work I don't have. This is a secondary quote. Looking backwards at history, it's easy to see for us to see that a moving earth and sun-centered universe gravely subverted Christian theology. If man's abode was not at the center of things, how could he be king? And of course, what he's referring to in the old system, known as geocentrism, from the Greek word ge, where we get words like geology and such, which is translated earth, taught that the earth was immobile and the sun was moving. So the earth was the center, that's why it's called geocentrism, and the sun revolved around the earth. That's sort of oversimplified, but that's it. And it was pioneered by the Greek astronomer Ptolemy, first century. Ptolemy says, now with this done, if one should next take up the question of Earth's position, the observed appearances with respect to it can only be understood if we put it in the middle of the heavens, at the center of the sphere of the heavens. Ptolemy's system is really based primarily on the thinking of Aristotle. Now we're going 300 plus years BC. Aristotle says, from these considerations, then it is clear that the earth does not move and does not lie elsewhere than at the center. Now that system has been displaced by what is referred to as heliocentrism, from the Greek word helios, meaning sun. So sun-centered. It taught that the sun was immobile relative to the earth, and that the earth was moving. And that was pioneered by the Polish astronomer Copernicus. And there are actually people that have hinted at it and talked about it, but no one to the fullest extent that Copernicus had done. But there are people that are slightly prior to Copernicus that are probably relevant in the credits. Copernicus says this hypothesis, or the hypothesis of this work, sets the earth in motion and puts an immovable sun at the center of things, or the center of the universe. Now this model was championed by Galileo. It was about 80 years later. So Copernicus had been vetted, for better or for worse, for about 80 years when Galileo. So Galileo didn't get in trouble because he was merely proposing heliocentrism, because heliocentrism had been around and everybody was talking about it, and no one had been persuaded significantly. So Galileo was more like a bulldog for this model, and really thought that it was critical that people come to understand that it was true, especially the church. Because he was worried the church was going to do what it ended up doing. By church, I mean the institutionalized church. He was worried that it was going to do what it ended up doing, and that was condemning the Copernican system. And then it later on, centuries later, had to rescind that condemnation and go, oh, I guess he was right after all. Although there is one Catholic scholar on the internet who's still defending geocentrism, a guy named Robert Sungenis, if you've seen his work. So if you're interested in how anybody could still do that, I'll commend Sungenis' work for you to read. So what does Galileo say? I have no idea. Now, if it is true that the center of the universe is that point around which all the orbs and world bodies, that is, the planets, move, it is quite certain that not the earth, but the sun is to be found at the center of the universe. Now, just so you'll know, they didn't give this job to chimps. Tycho Brahe, that's how I say it. How do you say it, right? You say Tycho, Tico, or Bubba? I think that was his name. He's more known as Bubba Brahe. Tycho Brahe was also proposed a third alternative. I thought you would find it interesting. He's actually buried in Church of Our Lady Before 10 in Prague, Czech Republic, which you're not allowed to go in and take pictures, unlike most churches I've been in Europe. But we sneaked in anyway and took a picture because that's where he's buried. Actually, I have to plead not guilty because my wife took these pictures. She's like, she's doing it. We're not supposed to. So that's where he's buried, even though he's from Rotterdam. And he actually proposed the Earth was the center of the moon and the sun, and then that whole thing was revolving Earth. The sun was the center of all things, and the whole thing was revolving around the Earth. So he had these sort of concentric circles, so it'll drive you nuts there, Charlie. But if you really want some good reading on this, and who doesn't when you think about it? There's nothing like staying up late and reading about history of the solar system. Is Michael Crow's book, Theories of the World from Antiquity to the Copernican Revolution. I can't wait to curl up with that one, man. I can't wait. When's the DVD out? I got to watch that one. Starring Richard Gere as heliocentrism. So what can we say to this? Is it true? And I used to hear this a lot as a graduate student. Now, maybe they're not saying it anymore, but I heard it a lot as a graduate student. Maybe that dates me a little much. In fact, I actually asked a professor when I was a graduate student and said, this doesn't seem to make sense that the Christians would be offended by being displaced from the center of the universe. Because that just doesn't seem like that would have been the thing that would have bothered them, and for the reasons that I'm about to show you. And he just went, nah, get out of here, you graduate student. So what can we say? Well, here's Moses Maimonides, probably outside of Moses himself, the most important thinker in the history of Judaism, at least one of the top 5 at least. Look what he says as a medieval philosopher, Jewish philosopher. In the case of the universe, the nearer the parts are to the center, the greater is their turbidness, their solidity, their inertness, and their dimness and darkness, because they are farther away from the loftiest element, from the source of light and brightness. So in other words, according to Maimonides in the Middle Ages, the worst place to be in the universe was the very center, because that's where everything, sort of like the drain in your shower. That's the worst place you'd want to eat out of, because that's where all the gunk goes down into, right? So everything's kind of trying to reach this center. And so the more dark and turbid and solid and material, as opposed to the light and lofty, including God himself, would be at the outermost. You have the same thing in Aquinas. He says, in the universe, Earth, that all the spheres encircle, and that as for place lies at the center, is the most material and coarsest. The word coarsest there, ignomilibellissima, the issima ending in Latin is the superlative. Like we say big est or small est, or that's a superlative. He's basically saying this is the most ignoble place to be, is the center. So following the logic, what the Christians should have done was have a party because we got promoted by the sciences, because we got moved from the center towards where God is. In fact, you can go all the way back to Aristotle, and he'll have the same, which is where basically both of these guys get it, is their commitment to Aristotle's philosophy. Is that as you go out in concentric spheres of the universe, the outermost in Aristotle were the 47 or 54, depending on how you slice the pie, gods. That's where the gods are, way out there. That's the best place to be. So it doesn't work. So it's ironic that, well, let me say that thought here. I'll say what I'm about to say. This is more relevant here. So it's an extension of this one point about, oh, well, you know, Christians are upset with science because it kicked us out of our place of privilege. And you go, it didn't. This idea of being the center is a very modern notion. Oh, you just think the whole world revolves around you. It's a modern notion. That's not the way the ancients thought about the center. But then as an extension of that specific point, Christianity has always stood against the advances of science. In the case of Galileo, it's proven. We met Draper before, He's, in his book, History of the Conflict Between Science, Religion, and Science. I mean, he was first president of American Chemical Society, founder of the New York University School of Medicine, taught chemistry. I mean, he's just a credentialed scholar. What does he say? Oh, no, that's not what he says. Hang on a second, let me get it here. The history of science is not a mere record of isolated discoveries. It is a narrative of the conflict of two contending powers. The expansive force of the human intellect on the one hand, and the compression arising from judiciary, faith, and human interest on the other. Another scholar in this regard is Andrew Dixon White's A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. Or here's my copy right here. This is what it looks like there. Bertrand Russell makes the same point, not to pick on Bertrand Russell. Galileo, as everyone knows, was condemned by the Inquisition. The Inquisition was successful in putting an end to science in Italy, which did not revive there for centuries. Which is, by the way, it's just factually, demonstrably false. That just absolutely is not true about the history of science. But that's not my point here. So what can we say? We can make the screen go away. We can do that. Hang on. By the way, you can do this if you want. You can talk awkwardly among yourselves. So what can we say in answer? Well, a very, very interesting book that I read a number of years ago that really got me thinking about some of these scientific things, because some of the material came to my mind having read this book. And this has got to be one of the best titled books of the night. Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. Now, Ronald Numbers is not a Christian, as far as I know. I think he was reared a Christian, but I don't think he's a Christian. This isn't a Christian book. This is a book, by the way, and I didn't realize until years ago that there was such discipline, of historians of science. Not the philosophy of science, not the history of the philosophy of science, but the history of science, which is a history degree. So you can actually get a PhD in that. I didn't realize you could do that until years ago. What does he say? He said, the greatest myth in the history of science and religion holds that they have been in a state of constant conflict. No one bears more responsibility for promoting this notion than two 19th century American polemicists, Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper. Francis Collins says, one of the greatest tragedies of our times is the impression that has been created that science and religion have to be at war. Now let me just add this caveat. I'm not suggesting that it might not be lamentable on the part of a scientist that certain aspects of contemporary religious thinking stands in opposition to, say, a consensus view among science. In other words, it's highly possible that there would be scientists who would regret, if not loathe, the fact that there are some Christians who believe the universe was created, or worse, was created, as a young Earth. So I'm not suggesting that's not there, that there aren't scientists that just hate what some religious people say. I'm making a more generalized observation, namely, in principle, what the Christians were doing through the history of Christianity and what the scientists were doing were not at odds with each other. In fact, the distinctions that we draw between science and philosophy, that's a very modern distinction as well. You don't find that in ancient. Aristotle would be looking at plants and then he'd be talking about metaphysics all in the same day, because it was just all knowledge, which is what the word science means. For example, the medieval Roman Catholic Church gave more financial and social support to the study of astronomy for over 6 centuries than any other and probably all other institutions. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but the reason they do that, doesn't matter the reason they did that. The fact is, they did that. They're not only not at war, they're funding astronomy. The reason they did that, by and large, was because it mattered to the church then of how to arrange the liturgical calendar. Because Easter, for example, was picked out during the year based upon what the moon was doing, the first full moon after the first Sunday, or the first Sunday after the first full moon following the vernal equinox. That's when Easter comes. So it can't be any earlier than X and it can't be any later than Y. But that's how it's picked. Well, you've got to be able to know when that's going to happen. When's the vernal equinox? When's that going to? They needed to know this. So they were pumping money into the study of astronomy. Mainly, I think, primarily to do the liturgical calendar, but nevertheless, it just proves the point. They weren't at war with one another. The medieval Roman period, or the medieval period, gave birth to the university, which developed with the support of the papacy. By 1500, there were about 60 universities across Europe, educating a cumulative total of several 100,000 students. About 30% of the curriculum were the natural sciences. And you had theology and philosophy and other kinds of things. So Michael Schenck, professor of early science at the University of Wisconsin, another article out of Galileo Goes to Jail, he says between 1150 and 1500, more literate Europeans had access to scientific materials than any of their predecessors in earlier cultures, thanks largely to the emergence, rapid growth, and naturalistic arts curriculum of medieval universities funded by the Roman Catholic Church. If the medieval church had intended to suppress the inquiry into nature, it must have been completely powerless, for it utterly failed to do so. Now, there's a lot. Galileo is sort of the poster child of this supposed conflict between religion and science. There's a lot, really, backstory to what really got Galileo into trouble. But two things stand out. One, his attempts to interpret the Bible to render it consistent with his scientific view got him in trouble with the church. Why? Because you're not allowed to interpret the Bible if you're not a priest. Period. It could be very, very serious criminal offense. So he didn't have the credentials in the eyes of the church authorities to give his opinion about anything about what the Bible meant. But yeah, he's just writing all these. He's writing letters to everybody, and he's writing these books and pontificating on how he thinks this verse is compatible with Copernicanism. And they're just like, shut up. You're not allowed to do that. Others might be allowed to do that, but you're not allowed to do that. That's one of the things that got him in trouble. Another thing that got him in trouble was his rejection of the Aristotelian model of the cosmos. See, this goes all the way back to Aristotle, 300-something years, this model of geocentrism and stuff, and other things that science did. But not only did this get him in trouble with the church, as we would say in Mississippi, where I was born and reared, reckon who else he got in trouble with. Any guesses who else was angry about what Galileo was doing?
The Protestants?
No? Because we
Other
don't.
scientists.
What's that?
Other scientists.
The scientists, the universities. Here's the thing. I mean, it's easy for us to look back on scientific paradigm shifts and then just sort of, oh yeah, well. But yet we can appreciate the fact that while these shifts are engaging, it's very painful. So Galileo comes along. He's championing Copernicus that had been vetted for 80 years, and almost none of the scientists agreed with Copernicus. They thought it had all kinds of problems of appearances and other things. So oddly, Galileo would be more akin, forgive me, for like the current day creationist who goes against the scientific consensus. He was bucking the scientific consensus. Now, they criticized the church for condemning Galileo, yet today people criticize the church for going against the consensus. But the church was going with the consensus against Galileo. You see that. They were doing exactly what today people complain them not doing. And I can't believe you don't accede to the opinions of this consensus of scientists. Well, when they did that in Galileo's day, you're crucifying them for it. No pun intended. So, while there can be no doubt that Galileo embracing the Copernicus system got him in trouble, serious trouble with the Christian officials, it must be remembered that his views are just as much connected to what I just said. I jump ahead of my PowerPoint. Like that. So, a couple of resources you might. Galileo, Bellarmine, and the Bible. This is a insight into the theological side of the dispute with Galileo, because the scientific stuff is probably more familiar to most people. So Bellarmine's argument was to Galileo when he was saying, well, the earth is standing still. I mean, the earth is moving and the sun is standing still. His argument was that, well, look, Joshua, chapter 10, Joshua commands the sun to stand still. Well, you can't command something to stand still that's not moving. How could he command the sun to stand still if it's still? So your model is just completely contrary to revealed truth. That was Bellarmine's argument. It took 200 years or so before the mathematicians more or less pushed Copernicanism over the finish line. Everybody started going, that probably works after all, because the math seems to confirm it. But I mean, you couldn't observe these kind of things. But I thought that was a pretty interesting argument. Now what do we do with that verse? Well, we do the same thing with that verse that we do with a handful of other verses in the Bible. We take it as phenomenological language of appearance. I mean, after all, the book of Joel says, the moon will turn to blood. I don't know anybody that's ever thought that it would actually become liquid and have corpuscles and plasma. No, it just turns red as it does on any full lunar eclipse, right? It just turns red like blood. So when he says the moon shall turn to blood, that's just language of appearance. When the sun stands still, that's just the language of appearance, because it looks like it moves, regardless of whether it's literally moving or not. Another resource I would commend is Behind the Scenes at Galileo's Trial. What's great about this is that it's got some treatises of Galileo all in one book that otherwise you'd have to sort of bounce around to get English translations of. Second, there's some newly translated English of Galileo. It's the first time in English in this book. So if you're interested in the Galileo thing, then that would do. Another one that's a sort of industry standard is the Galileo Affair. All of these are in the deck. Here was one I just read recently, Galileo's Misstatements about Copernicus. Ooh, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Actually, I think it does. Another good book, When Science and Christianity Meet. There's Ronald Numbers and David Lindbergh. And I would commend to you, if you're ever in Florence, Italy, that you could go to what used to be called the Museo di Storia della Scienza, now called the Museo Galileo. Here's the traveler's guide. There's two reasons why you want to go. The original name was the Museum of the History of Science. Museum of the History of Science. There's two reasons why you want to go. First of all, because you can see Galileo's two telescopes. That's the originals right there. And second, you can tell people that Galileo gave you the finger, because that's Galileo's finger there. And yes, it is the middle finger, according to the resources. So you say, yeah, he gave me the finger. A little brush with greatness there. How many of you that Galileo gave you the finger? All right, what about the Bible was written by the same people who said the earth was flat? Again, I'm not making this up. That's a bumper sticker and a t-shirt both you can buy on the internet. Daniel Dennett, in his book Darwin's Dangerous Idea, says, if you insist on teaching your children falsehood, that the earth is flat, that man is not the product of evolution. Notice how he unificates those two. That your belief that man did not evolve exactly the way the conventional view is, but that there was special creation, is in Daniel Dennett's mind as egregious of you believing that the earth is flat. He equates the two on scientific par. Notice that as we go along. Here, hang on a second. Let me get a couple of more quotes out. How about this? The church says the earth is flat, but I know that it is round, for I have seen the shadow on the moon, and I have more faith in a shadow than in the church. Magellan. Or Barack Obama. Here's the sad thing. Lately, we've heard a lot of professional politicians talking down new sources of energy. We've heard this kind of thinking before. Some of these folks were around when Columbus set sail. They must have been founding members of the Flat Earth Society. Notice what he's doing is he's linking Columbus with flat earth views. Notice that. They must not have believed that the world was round. So what can we say in response? Well, first of all, with respect to Old Testament writers and the question of the flat earth, in our defense as Christians, we would say nobody didn't believe in a flat earth if you go back far enough in history from what we can tell. Okay, so ancient cosmogonies and things. So it isn't an indictment on an Old Testament writer if he happened to believe the earth was flat, since that's kind of what everybody believed. That's different than him teaching that the earth is flat, which that's not taught anywhere in the Bible. And even the language, the four corners of the earth. Well, first of all, that wouldn't make sense, because even if they believed it was flat, they wouldn't believe it was square. They'd believe it was a disc. So the four corners doesn't explain anything. So we'll give you that. Yeah, probably, maybe Moses. I don't know. I'm just saying, even if he did, that's really not an indictment on them any more than it's an indictment on everybody if you go back far enough. All right? But what about after that time? What can we say? Well, people have known that the earth was a sphere since way before the time of Christ. Did you know that? I think a lot of people are surprised to know that. Aristotle, the earth's shape must be interrupted by the technical problems that Richard is having. The earth's shape must be spherical. And he gives both observational arguments for the earth as a sphere, and philosophical arguments. His observational arguments were, well, look, you just stand on the beach and just watch a ship go away. You just watch it, then the hull disappears first, and you still see the mast. And then finally the mast disappears. Aristotle's argument, it obviously is going down like a ball. That was one of his arguments. The other was one you saw earlier, where everything, in their view, just tended towards the center. What you might even observe in a charitable kind of way is a rudimentary concept of gravity. Everything is kind of going towards the center. Well, Aristotle said, all things being equal, if you've got a given amount of mass that's all trying to go to the center, the most parsimonious shape it will take is a sphere, unless something just blocks it. It'll just naturally form a sphere. And he said that's why all the heavenly bodies, all the planets and all the stars are spheres, so obviously the earth is a sphere, he said. Another ancient quote, just to make that point, a little bit later on, was Ptolemy. Now, that also the earth taken as a whole is sensibly spherical, we could most likely think out this way. And he goes on in the Alchemist to give his arguments for the spherical earth. So, now, some have said, oh yeah, fine, Aristotle believed it, maybe even as late as Ptolemy, but that more or less gets marginalized by the onset of Christianity, and it's the Christians that more or less have driven this concept to the edges, and so now the general consensus was back to a flat earth, and that's what carries on. That's just not true. While it is true that there are certain few holdouts in early Christian history for a flat earth, the main reason, really the only reason why we're still talking about those two figures today is because they were flat earth. That's what makes them so notable, is that nobody was flat earth except these two guys. So another book by Toby Lester, The Fourth Part of the World, The Race to the Ends of the Earth, and the epic story of the map that gave America its name. He says, medieval Europeans, even the most learned of geographers among them, are to this day often described as having believed that the world was flat. This simply isn't true. Thanks in large part to the labors of Arab astronomers and mathematicians, ancient Greek proofs of the earth as spherical had survived into the Middle Ages and were circulating in Europe. How's this for a book? Christine Garwood's Flat Earth, The History of an Infamous Idea. She says, although very few writers of the patristic period would be the first centuries of the church, or the church fathers, pater from the Greek word for father, 1st to 8th centuries, argued in favor of a flat earth, Lactantius and Cosmos Indicopleustes, I think that's his last name, were held up as typical medieval thinkers by Victorian rationalist writers who were set on sidelining religious belief as damaging to the progress of scientific truth. So she's just saying these two guys, Lactantius and Cosmos Indicopleustes, were the holdouts. We're still trying to argue for a flat earth against the consensus of everybody. Aquinas says the physicist proves the earth to be round by one means, the astronomer by another. For the latter proves this by means of mathematics, for example, by the shapes of ellipses or something of the sort, while the former proves it by means of physics, for example, by the movement of heavy body towards the center and so forth. He's referencing Aristotle there. So now we're in the 13th century. Copernicus, maybe not surprising, the earth is globe-shaped too, since on every side it rests upon its center. In fact, Aristotle gives an interesting argument about walking down to Egypt and walking up into northern Europe and how the star changes and what you see. He says it's a ball. So it's endured all the way up. Now we're into the 15th century. So what can we make of these earlier quotes? Ferdinand Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan never said this. This is what we've come to know as fake news. It's all over the internet. In fact, what I just discovered in the past few days when I was sort of rehearsing some of this material in my mind is that some sources have they've gone to individual websites to prove to them this is not Magellan's quote, and they've started correcting it to say, oh yeah, we know where this quote comes from. It comes from Robert Ingersoll. And I'm not suggesting he did it for any nefarious reasons. He could very well have thought it was Magellan. But Robert Ingersoll was a 19th century atheist, agnostic, and wrote a 12-volume set. And so I'm not suggesting he deliberately tried to do it, but the quote basically was, someone said, I think it was Magellan, and then he gives that quote. And then that just got picked up by everybody as being from Magellan. He was just more or less saying, well, I heard someone say, I think it might have been Magellan. And I don't have any reason to think that if somebody just said, no, it wasn't Magellan. Oh, okay, I thought it was, but who was it? Then he would have gone on from there. But it got into his work, and then it got picked up, and of course the internet makes it a lot more easy for fake news to get passed around. Well, what about Barack Obama equating Columbus and the flat earth? Here's another myth. People say, well, the reason why Columbus had trouble getting people to go on his voyage was they were afraid of falling off the edge of the earth. That wasn't at all what they were afraid of, because everybody knew it was a sphere. The reason he had trouble getting people to agree to go with him on the voyage is that they were afraid that the voyage would take so long because the earth was so big, they'd run out of food and starve to death. They just weren't convinced you could physically carry enough food to traverse the Atlantic Ocean. That's why he couldn't get people to go. It had nothing to do with thinking that the world was flat. So here's the President of the United States carelessly linking this kind of myth that, oh yeah, that's Columbus. No, flat earth, that went away about the 4th century BC. So Leslie Cormack, she's got an article in the Ronald Numbers book. This equation of rotundity, that is the idea of roundness, this equation of roundness with modernity also explains why 19th century American historians claim that it was Columbus and the early mercantiles who proved the earth was round and thereby ushered in modernity and America. In fact, it was a biography, I'll finish the quote that you can't see. It was a biography of Columbus by the American author Washington Irving, the creator of Rip Van Winkle, that introduced this idea to the world. So the fact that Columbus thought that, and maybe Barack Obama honestly thought that. All right, what about most scientists are atheists, therefore belief in God is not scientific?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Is this format for questions at all? Or?
There are, although I think we'll have time to. We'll have time to do it, but I'm happy for you.
I can put a bookmark in it.
All right, I'm happy for you to do it. It gives me time to think about what my answer. Gives me time to Google my answer.
Yeah, okay.
You know, it's funny you asked me that because I was just thinking. I was just reading. So now you can already anticipate what I might say in this regard because I've already said the punchline, but just in case. The Pew Research Center, for example, shows that the surveys they've shown in terms of belief in God among members of the American Academy of Sciences, I think was where the survey was taken, versus the general public. So, 94% of the scientists disbelieve in God or universal spirit or whatever. The general public, 90-something% of the general public holds that they do. It would be 41 plus 18 plus 33, so it's like 93% disagree. So the statistic is there that, and I'm not denying that there might be a preponderance of atheists among the scientific community, although some have argued that the statistics are misleading because it's a very small sample. There's millions of scientists in the world, and most of these samples deal in groups of about several thousand by means of certain types of organizations. I'll leave that squabble because I think the problem's worse than that. In the past, most scientists believed in God. So would someone be willing, would Ingersoll, for example, be willing, although maybe by his day most of them did, would anybody take the fact that scientists used to all believe in the existence of God as in any way relevant to whether God exists? I don't think so. In fact, you could speculate, well, what are scientists going to believe in the future? So what are scientists believing right now that someday they're going to look back on the way today's scientists look back on, say, celestial mechanics as a proper way of dealing with subatomic particles? Instead of say, well, we're kind of beyond that. It doesn't quite work. But we don't mock Newton for some of his ideas. We just say, no. But Newton couldn't possibly have anticipated, I don't think, Einstein and relativity theory and stuff. But the question of God's existence is a philosophical question, not a scientific question. And I think that's the problem, is that when anybody tries to pull the trigger on a conclusion in an area that they're not privy to of the tools, like people making, like I would never write a book called The Evolution Delusion, for example. I would never write a book. It would be the most ridiculous dereliction of scholarly duty one can imagine. Because I am not a scientist at all. But at least I know I'm not a scientist, and I'm not sort of feigning some, oh yeah, I can tell you all about evolution. I know Christians do stuff like that. And groups like RTB try their best to educate people, go, you're speaking out of your ignorance. You just need to be quiet. get educated, and then you can talk about the science, or do like the rest of us, just don't talk about it. I just say, well, I know some books, and I got some friends, and you can talk to them. But for some reason, Richard Dawkins never felt any hesitation that he somehow was an expert on whether God existed. And when I first saw his book in 2008 on the bookshelf in a Borders, actually. You guys remember Borders? So, and I looked in the table of contents, and he had a section on Thomas Aquinas. I did my doctoral dissertation in Aquinas, specifically in Aquinas' arguments for God's existence, one argument that he gave. I was thrilled to think, oh, great, here's an atheist that's going to deal with Aquinas, because you don't find it. I don't find any that really do that. I'm telling you, I just don't find them. I'd be happy to know. But contemporary atheist academics who actually seem to me to demonstrate that they've actually read Aristotle and Aquinas. Be that as it may, I get to the Dawkins thing, and it's like, he just doesn't know what he's talking about. Now, that doesn't prove atheism is false. No, I'm not making that argument. I'm just saying he doesn't know what he's talking about. There are a lot better atheists to read. I had a friend who met, she's an apologist, and she had a young man in her presence who was all giddy about Dawkins and reading the God Delusion. She said, there are a lot better atheists to read than Richard Dawkins. She was recommending more. I said, you need to read Michael Martin from Boston University, or J.L. Mackey from Oxford University, some of these guys. That's who you need to read if you're going to get some really substantial atheism. All right? Well, virtual particles prove that something can come from nothing. Daniel Dennett again. Some deny the premise that everything must have a cause, since quantum physics teaches us, doesn't it, that everything that happens needs to have a cause. So he's just taking, again, now he's a philosopher who's not a scientist, so he's sort of the inverse of Dawkins. All right? So he's more or less just saying, don't the scientists tell us that? And that made it into my book. How could we respond? Well, the claim that physicists have observed that certain particles arise out of a quantum vacuum and thus come out of nothing without a cause. That's the claim. But this is not what's going on with virtual particles. And I'm just depending on my sources here. We've got scientists here who can correct me during the Q&A. Actually, though, I'm just doing a Q, Richard. We're not doing it yet. you get a lot more questions in when you do that. Frank Tipler, John Barrow, in their book, The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, says this. Isn't this fun? I'll tell you, it's not too bad. The modern picture of the quantum vacuum differs radically, which, by the way, I have a Kirby vacuum. It's a lot better. Never mind. The modern picture of the quantum vacuum differs radically from the classical and everyday meaning of a vacuum, which is nothing. The quantum vacuum states are defined simply as local or global energy minimum. The quantum mechanical vacuum is not truly nothing. Rather, the vacuum state has a rich structure which resides in a previously subsisting substrate. In fact, if any of you are old enough and were there, or maybe you've seen on the internet, William Lane Craig's debate with Peter Atkins at the Jimmy Carter Center back in 1990, 12, whatever it was. I forget exactly when that happened. Was anybody there or have seen that debate?
I've seen it.
You've seen it? Yeah, you weren't born then.
Oh, I was.
Well, this dates me as well. It was a Kodak moment when Peter Atkins said, well, the universe came into existence out of nothing, and just uncaused out of nothing. There was just nothing before the universe, and then the universe just comes into existence uncaused. And so when Bill said, well, unpack that a little bit, he said, well, because this nothing were swirling mathematical points. That's what he said. You just go, that's not nothing then. It's at least whatever a mathematical point is and whatever it looks like within the swirl. It's not nothing literally. So, and again, I'm not suggesting that Atkins was trying to sneak one in. That's just how he's thinking about it as a scientist, going, no, what we mean by nothing is not what Aristotle would have meant by nothing, which is that which rocks dream about. Remember that?
Yeah.
That's what nothing is. So what can we say in response? Well, that's it. I thought I had more than one I was going to show you, but I'm not. Let's do the last one, and then we'll take... how about if I just give an answer? That'd be cool. I'm going to try that one out. Just give answers without the question. Go, oh, yes, Bismarck, North Dakota. 4.5. And you're just, I was trying to figure out what the question is. That's a great answer. What's the question?
42.
Yeah, 42. That's the answer. So if God created the biological complexity of the world, he must be no less complex. Again, our beloved Richard Dawkins. But of course, any God capable of intelligently designing something as complex as the DNA protein replicating machine must have been at least as complex and organized as that machine itself. However statistically improbable the entity you seek to explain by invoking a designer, the designer himself has got to be at least as improbable. Sam Harris says, any being capable of creating a complex world promises to be very complex himself. As biologist Richard Dawkins, at least he cites his sources there, observed repeatedly, the only natural process we know that could produce a being capable of designing things is evolution. Well, of course, I could probably use this for the sciences, because right there it's like, well, yeah, but what about a metaphysical process? Not supernatural, but metaphysical. Well, what is that? That's the stuff philosophers talk about. What about that process? Maybe it's not good either, but you didn't deal with it. You just immediately, well, the only natural process, you go, well, wait a minute, you're just eliminating some others. So what can we say? Well, the reasoning, I think there's several things to say here. The reasoning is based on the assumption of physicalism, the view that maintains that everything that is real is physical, which I think is demonstrably false. A great resource is Edward Fazer's The Last Superstition, because he shows that you couldn't even do science without things like universals. A universal would be something like humanity. So the example I use sometimes is when during the Nuremberg trials, when the Nazis were were indicted on these crimes. Remember, the justices in the trial from the Soviet Union, France, UK, and the United States. But they couldn't try the Nazi defendants on the basis of the laws of those nations because they weren't citizens of those nations. But they also couldn't try them on the basis of the laws of Germany because they didn't break any German laws. Everything was legal by the time Hitler made sure that the Constitution and the law was tooled to tee up the final solution to the Jewish question. So how did they indict them? Well, as far as I know, this is the first time this phrase was used in the history of jurisprudence. And we still use it today. They were accused of committing crimes against humanity. So the philosopher wants to go, well, what is a humanity? What is a humanity? Is it male or female? Well, is it old or young? Is it black or white? Is it sick or well? What is a humanity? Well, it's none of those things. It's a universal. Well, is it real or not? In any sense of the term real. If you say no, it's not real in any sense of the term. It's just a concept, a name, as Occam would say, or as Hume would say. Then how could you commit a crime against it? If it's not real. If it is real, in some sense of the term real, I submit to you, likely, if you think humanity is real in some sense, you're either going to be some form of the thinking of Plato or some form of the thinking of Aristotle that have just forged the contours of Western civilization, each of whom have their sort of Christian installation. Augustine Christianized Platonism, and Aquinas is Christianized Aristotelianism. Now, there are other options, but I'm saying by and large, you're going to be variations, or as Alfred North White has said, footnotes to these original thinkers. But at any rate, I digress. There's no reason to think that minds, which are capable of creating complex objects and processes, must themselves be complex. That is, not complex meaning difficult, but complex meaning made of parts. So the mind of a computer programmer need not be as complex as the software he composes. In fact, don't they already believe that the current complexity of the physical world can be reduced at higher energy levels at more unified field levels, right, between the four forces of nature? So as you go back, presumably the unified field theory gets us back to one. Well, that's exactly what we're saying in principle. As you go back far enough, you get to something quite simple. And I think also the assumption is based on the commitment to Darwinism, in the worst sense of the term Darwinism. But is Darwin as scientific as many suppose? Dennett says, there are vigorous controversies around the evolutionary theory, but those who feel threatened by Darwinism should not take heart from this fact. The basic Darwinian idea is about as secure as any in science. If you insist on teaching your children falsehoods that the earth is flat, that man is not the product of evolution, this is a quote we saw earlier, then you must expect that we will describe your teachings as falsehoods. and will attempt to demonstrate this to your children at our earliest opportunity. Victor Stenger says, in terms of the same strict standards of empirical evidence that apply on all natural sciences, Darwinian evolution is a well-established theory. Sam Harris says, here is what we know. There is no question that human beings evolved from non-human ancestors. There is no reason whatsoever to believe that individual species were created in their present form, which, by the way, is a fallacy and false dilemma, because there might be other options besides those two. Back to the National Geographic, did you notice the front? You've got evolution never happened. This is the war on science. The moon landing was fake. These are two examples National Geographic has of the war on science. So think of these notions. The basic ideas, as secure as any, challenging evolution on par with the moon landing. There is no question. It's a well-established theory. Is this so? I don't know if you've seen the website, Scientific Dissent from Darwinism. If you're a credentialed scientist and you agree with this statement, we are skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutations in natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. Then you're invited to sign this petition. I want you to see some of the signatories here. So, yeah, we're actually what happens, the song ends and then it just keeps going for days and days. And I don't think I've ever spoke anywhere where I let the whole thing run all the way through.
You should use Alice's
Except those
restaurant.
times when I didn't want to do Q&A. Then I tried to let it run. All right, now just some closing observations here that are important that you know that what I am and am not saying. This doesn't mean that Darwinism is false. Not everybody that signed that is reputing Darwinism. So that's not the point. What is the point? Here's the point. In fact, it doesn't even mean that all the signatories repudiate evolution as a whole in any sense. It does mean, however, that such statements as the idea is about as secure as any in science, or that it's a well-established theory, or there is no question, is unwarranted. Those are just unwarranted statements. So I won't do this here, but what you can do with the deck is get a series of resources, some of which you've already seen, but others, they're just a picture of the book and the author, and most of it is pretty obvious what the resource is relevant to.